I think he was what would be called the rabbi's rabbi. You know, Rabbi Akiba in the Talmud is called the rabbi's rabbi, and for us liberal rabbis, John was the rabbi's rabbi.
I think he was the leading British progressive rabbi in his time, and one of the leaders of progressive Judaism in the world.
I am sure that the word that will come to mind of all the people who are talking about John is the word integrity.
I consider myself very blessed to have had John as a mentor and a friend and as a rabbi.
I've always described him as a holy man. I've always thought of him as a holy man. I know it sounds odd, but I do think that.
He was born in Berlin. He was forced to attend a Jewish school.
Many stories about his experience of discrimination in a German classroom and then being removed from ordinary school and sent to a Jewish school.
My father and John were both at school in Berlin a year or two apart.
Theodor Herzl had a great influence on John and on me too, because it was the only Zionist Jewish school in Berlin. Hebrew was taught every day, and the teachers were even called by their first names. They're very secular, but also very progressive.
Growing up in the environment that they did, and having the opportunities taken away from them and the restrictions placed on them when they were going into early teenage years, shaped them a lot.
Late, I think in 1939, his parents hadn't left the country and put him on a Kindertransport to England.
He talked about coming over on the Kindertransport and being met by a lady who was a Quaker, as far as I remember, and she met him at the station and took him up to the north of England, where he was fostered by an Anglican bishop.
As far as we were concerned, and I'm sure it was the same for John, it did come out in his writings later, being separated from your family has an enormous effect.
We discovered that his parents and my mum were forced to leave Berlin on the same transport, and of course that made an even stronger bond between us.
He had a terrible nightmare about his parents, and they were deported on that very day when he had his nightmare. He was tremendously grateful to Great Britain for taking him in, and he always had a sense of gratitude throughout his life.
And I think how brave he was to come over here, as so many others did, but how he just took to liberal Judaism here and became one of its major leaders.
He joined the liberal Jewish community in Liverpool, and they introduced him to Dr. Mattock. Definitely was Dr. Mattock's influence that he became a rabbi. I first met him in the alumni, which is a youth group of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, when I was about 17 and he was at university. He was very handsome, and I fell in love with him straight away. At that time, I don't think he was even contemplating becoming a rabbi. And we didn't really meet up very much until I was about 22, and then I met him through the World Union Youth section and became editor of a newsletter for the World Union Youth section, and he was chairman at the time. And then shortly after that, in October 1954, we got engaged, and then we got married in 1955. He became a rabbi. He was ordained 2 years before we married, and in South London, Liberal Synagogue. He was a rabbi for 4 years, 2 years after we were married.
John then insisted that he would go to Hebrew Union College and get a rabbinical degree there. You know, having studied here wasn't enough for him. He was very keen on high scholarly standard.
After South London Liberal Synagogue, was destined really, I suppose, to be rabbi of this synagogue.
When I was very little, because his name was John, and the the synagogue was in St. John's Wood, I actually thought he might be God. And I used to think he was like really special, really important. And when he wore his long black gown and his talit and his kippah, and he was standing at the front of the synagogue with hundreds of people on the big occasions, I used to sit there thinking that I was really proud of him.
His sermons, week by week, I mean, everybody flocked to hear. He could get very, very emotional during a sermon, you know, he was an orator.
He was a most wonderful speaker. He had a marvellous voice. He put his thoughts clearly. He made them comprehensible.
He once said to me that he was really glad that he hadn't gone into scholarship per se, but he was very, very interested in people.
He was always available to people, be it his congregants, be it his students, and he was always available.
Because he never, ever would say something that he didn't mean. People knew that they could trust him. That's a pretty big thing, and I think that probably was very central in what people felt and experienced with John.
I went on a weekend with our peers, and at that weekend Rabbi John Rayner was present, and I assumed he would be this great man of great stature, great learning, and what he taught me on that weekend was to lift weights. And I have never forgotten the fact that here was this amazing rabbi who was just participating with us as young people, doing the things that we wanted to do, and just enjoying the time being together. And of course, we studied with him and we learned from him as well.
My strongest memory was when we went on the confirmation retreats with David Goldberg, who was my other confirmation teacher, and Julia Neuberger. And in the evenings when the sessions, the very serious study sessions were finished, you could actually see him relax even with his students.
Now, John, off duty, with all these sort of 15-year-olds, was a completely different person. One of the things we would do was rush up and down the stairs trying to stop all the boys and the girls mixing for fairly obvious reasons. And John had this amazing sense of humour. I just have this kind of wonderful mental picture of rushing up one staircase to meet John, rushing down the next one, you know, constantly. It was a bit like Snakes and Ladders.
He had a great sense of humour. One of my lasting memories of him is at a youth conference when we were all, must have been about 1953, 54, and we were all outside on the lawns of the conference centre, and John suddenly did a handstand and then started to walk on his hands, and everybody was saying, is that John Rayner doing that? And so that was a lovely, so the human side of him.
I worked with him at Leobeck College when he was Director of Studies. I was an officer of the college at the time. And the effect he had on that organization and on its students is similarly an incredible impact, and taught generations of students, and that has had an effect in the Rabbinate now.
He made it very clear what he thought the college should be, how his expectations for the college should be upheld.
He was a wonderful teacher. He was so clear.
While I was at the college as a teacher, he exemplified the good, prepared, but spontaneous lecturer.
I'll never forget the trip we made as a class to see John's filing system. Now, you may think going to see a filing system would be one of the most boring events you can imagine. But there we were, we went into John's study, and every piece of paper that he had was numbered according to the drawer in which it had to go, and it was cross-referenced with every other drawer where this piece of paper might be of use. So no wonder he could always find, and this was before computers, when of course you can do that sort of stuff on computers these days more easily. This was done by hand, all sorted. It was an amazing eye-opener to the man and to a way of underpinning your pastoral work with the discipline of the academic world.
I remember the first letter I received from him that was critical of a sermon I'd given. And I went to one of my colleagues and I said, look, I got this letter from John and it's so critical of what I've done. And everyone laughed and said that they had lots of those letters, that he really taught us how to be exacting and take care and pride in what we did.
There's a pile of letters in which he says things like, you know, I was really amused by this, I really like that, but by the way, on page 3, page 49, page 66, there are mistakes. This is what you ought to have said. He never stopped reading thoroughly, criticising, but also praising.
But he never seemed to make dates in his diary for 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock or 4 o'clock. It was 7 minutes past 1, 13 minutes past 2, because he filled his time exactly.
John, not that I'm aware, ever took a day off.
And something he taught me that I've always remembered, he said to me, why would you do the minimum? We have the human capacity to do the maximum. Why wouldn't you do that? And that has always stayed with me.
Above all, I would say he was somebody who was very thoughtful in all senses of the words. He thought before he spoke, and he thought before he acted, and he thought well.
He had the most extraordinary liturgical knowledge, but not just knowledge. He had great sensitivity.
Well, he's got a very particular legacy, which are the prayer books. Service of the Heart, Gate of Repentance, Siddur Chadash. That's an enormous gift because, you know, he was known to his congregation, he was known to his students and his colleagues, but every single liberal synagogue in the country opens the prayer book that he was the main person who was responsible for crafting those prayers.
He co-edited our prayer book, Siddur Chadash, with Chaim Stern, and I was the technical editor. It was an absolute delight to work with him. He was very, very meticulous, but then so am I, so, you know, that worked very well.
Well, I had the honour of being on the advisory panel for those prayer books. And it was a real eye-opener how he prepared. He'd come with reams and reams of paper, researching every little prayer, every expression, going right back to prayer books over the centuries.
He was one of the few liberal Jews of his time who was actually interested in halakhah.
I certainly think that his writings are very much on a par with those of Israel Mattock, and will be studied and quoted from in the same way in the future.
He, perhaps even more than Mattock's prayer book, established a thing that we should be honest in the prayers we print in the liberal Jewish prayer books. Not for him hiding behind theological problems by a mistranslation or something like that. You had to be honest and upfront.
He combined deep sort of secular learning with deep Jewish learning.
He took traditional halakhah, traditional texts and codes, and tried to work them through in a new way. So hence thinking about sexuality and about homosexuality, and saying we had to rethink our attitude to homosexuality. He was early in doing that. There are very many other issues like that, but he would take an issue, look at the tradition, turn it and say, come on, progressive Jews, have a think about this.
His sermons were always amazing. If there was something, and in those days, some really difficult issue like AIDS, and how should the Jewish community respond to AIDS, there was this kind of myth that nice Jews don't do these things and don't get AIDS. And John actually read out in a sermon that something about, it's called Kaposis sarcoma. It's a particularly nasty disorder that happens with sufferers of AIDS. And he made the congregation sit and listen to that, because what he was saying to people is, being a good liberal Jew is about being real, about the issues of the world in which you live.
He was not afraid to put himself forward to fight for a cause in which he believed, even if it made him unpopular.
He was a very strong exponent of ethical Zionism. So what was happening in Israel over the years really upset him.
He demanded that Israel, in its foreign relations, in its relations with the Palestinians, should behave ethically. And he had a major controversy with a representative of the American Jewish Committee on the Internet. He faced facts, and he made other people face facts. And that is a very strong feature in a rabbi.
There is one time that he changed his mind, and I was privileged to be there when it happened, at least one time that I know of. And it was the consultancy committee for the new prayer book, Siddur Chadash. At that time I was not a rabbi, but I was on the lay consultancy group. And one of our female members indicated that she felt the issue of non-gender language for the name of God in the new prayer book was an issue of justice, not an issue of language, not an issue of technical ability, but it was an issue of justice. John Rayner had up to that time not been in favour of gender-free and gender-neutral language in the prayer book. But from that moment on, after he reflected on that statement, he realised that as someone who was deeply embedded in a Judaism that reflected justice, that he could no longer hold a position that he himself now felt was actually unjust.
Over time, he actually began to appreciate the importance of inclusive language, and indeed was party to creating a prayer book, which was the first inclusive language prayer book in this country.
He approached me a number of times to tell me that he was wrong and that he understood now what the importance was of neutral God language, and I've never forgotten that.
He actually was happy to sort of turn around to me and say, thank you for that. You and other women, younger colleagues, have sort of shown me that this matters. So he actually wasn't just a teacher. Like all great teachers, he was willing to also learn from his students.
He consciously tried to restructure and create a liberal Judaism for the late 20th century, the post-war years, the post-establishment of the State of Israel years.
Some of us wilder liberals tend to be quite keen to just throw everything out the window and try and invent something completely new. I think John was there to help to ground us in some of the traditions and the histories of what liberal Judaism stood for.
He brought to liberal Judaism an unremittingly moral outlook on the world.
Gratitude to everything John did for me, I wrote a letter to John Major. And I wrote, this man deserves to get the Queen's honor. I quoted the president of this synagogue, who was also OBE, and all these Christians, showed their esteem for John Rayner, and why he finally got without any doubt, got the CBE.
It meant such a lot that he should be honoured by the Queen as a refugee. I think it meant the world to him.
I saw him 3 days before he died at his house, and I was then president of a synagogue. And the president, or the most senior person, reads Jonah on the afternoon of Yom Kippur. So I mentioned this to him, and he sort of pulled himself together, ill as he was. He said, now Willie, let me tell you, Jonah was not a prophet or saint, he was a sinner. And the sailors he was with were much better human beings and people than he was. And I had a 10-minute sermon, as it were, on Jonah, when he was so poorly and in pain, and he still had this discipline.
I just felt that after my dad died, that there was a lot more that I didn't actually know about him, which would be the case with everyone, but I realised that he was a very much deeper person than I'd ever known.
We have to consolidate what he taught and build on what he taught so that the legacy that he created and the teachings that he gave us don't get lost in the mists of time.
We talked about the 3 M's. They were the leaders, they started it all. They were great people, but he is the one that in the 20th century has really given strength to the movement.
On my desks, I have a photo of John. It's accompanied by a photo of my father, and I look at the photos each day.
A loving father, a loving husband, and I think a very loving person.
A teacher, a role model, and a friend.